Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is Dr. Charles Johnson, a National Book Award winner. Thank you so much for being here, Charles.
Thank you for having me.
So many great writers, I'm thinking of Flannery O'Connor, Doug Marlette, began as cartoonists. What did you learn from cartooning that's helped you be a better writer?
Well, you could also mention John Updike.
Well, of course, yes,
Yeah,
John Updike.
He said he loved cartooning more than he did his own writing. Well, I think I'm very visual, just naturally, and from the time I was a kid in elementary school, that was the one thing that I did best was draw. And so I pursued that. I was a student of cartoonist Lawrence Laurier in New York. He was cartoon editor of Parade magazine. He published about 100 books. He was also a writer of murder mysteries back in the 30s and 40s. But I wasn't really thinking about becoming a writer. I always wanted to be an illustrator and a cartoonist. Until one day, and I would write for fun. I'd write plays with friends for fun. I kept a journal since I was 12 years old. But one day a novel occurred to me, that one right there on top.
Yes, Faith in the Good Thing.
Yeah, that was my first published novel back around 1974. And one novel tends to lead to the other. Before you finish one, I've got an idea for the next one. And so, they kind of just reel out. But I had a particular aim in mind when I became a writer. My background was journalism, bachelor's in journalism, master's in philosophy, and my doctorate's in philosophy. And my particular, I hope, contribution to literary culture is in the area of the philosophical novel, the novel of ideas. And I thought we could do some things, I could do some things that would enrich that in terms of African-American literature and American literature in general. My mentor back in the early 70s was John Gardner, who was also known as a philosophical novelist with novels like Grindel and Sunlight Dialogues. John was very much interested in, philosophy as well. And then there's a couple of other people you could mention. Saul Bellow, I think, is a good example. And then going back in time, I look at my own predecessors being more or less like Ralph Ellison with Invisible Man, Richard Wright with his very interesting fusion of existentialism and Marxism, and then finally Gene Toomer, who published in 1923 the first book that kicked off the Harlem Renaissance, Cain. Cain is a classic and very interested in kind of Eastern ideas. So that's basically how I got from cartooning to writing, although I still love to draw whenever the opportunity presents itself.
In this first novel you mentioned, Faith in the Good Thing. Her dying mother tells Faith to go out and get the good thing.
Get yourself a good thing.
Get yourself a good thing.
Right.
How closely did you identify with Faith in her odyssey?
Well, very much. She's in a philosophical quest. It's the stories in the form of a folk tale. And, every one of my novels has a question at the center of it. That novel, the question is, what is the good? What is the good? And so she meets a lot of people who try to tell her it's this and it's that, and she has to work her way through all of those partial truths until she realizes what she feels is the good at the end. The novel after that, Oxfording Tale, the central question that's kind of like the meditation is, what is the self? And then Middle Passage, which is the one, the book that got the National Book Award, that question is, where is home? Where is home? Because the characters are lost at sea. And then the final, my last novel, Dreamer, the central question there, because it's about the last two years in the life of Martin Luther King, the central question there is, how do we end evil without creating or engendering new evil? So when I do a novel, it's really a meditation. I'm not looking for final answers, but I want to explore the questions and dramatize the questions. And I'll tell you why. I said this maybe 2 days ago for an interview I did with philosopher Michael Boylan for Philosophy TV, and that may be up pretty soon. We did a book together earlier this year. It's a philosophy textbook called Philosophy: An Innovative Introduction. We have 10 stories about philosophers to dramatize the actual primary texts that in the textbook. And so we did an interview for Philosophy TV, and so Michael and I are talking about, well, what is philosophy and literature? What is this all about? Well, I said, Michael, people feel philosophy happens up here. Abstractions, removed from life. But that's not true. What we do is we abstract the questions so we can study them, but they begin down here in quotidian everyday life, in the muck and mud of existence and struggle, and those are where the questions arise. And so what I try to do as a philosophical novelist is take the abstract perennial questions, which are, discussed in seminars, and put them back in the dramatic, muddy, gritty situations from which they originally arose.
You mentioned your second novel, Ox Herding Tale, and in the new introduction you wrote to a reprint version of that, you challenged your readers to compare the book to Alice Walker's The Color Purple. Elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, those books came out the same year. That was the hardest book I ever had to do in my life because absolutely nobody believed in it. Nobody understood it.
Really?
Nobody. To be honest, and not to pat myself on the back, but just to be honest, it was about 20 years ahead of its time in the late, when I was doing it in the late 70s. Doing a lot of things that had never been done before in American literature and African American literature. And it was rejected 24 times.
Seriously?
24 times. It was initially published by my friend, John Gallman at Indiana University Press. He wanted to do 2 or 3 novels that year, and mine was one, and 2 others. But it has never been out of print since it was initially published in 1982. People write dissertations about it, articles about it. It's been around for a while, but it was one of those kind of books where you have to say to yourself, or projects, nobody in the entire universe seems to understand what I want to do here, but that doesn't matter. Because had I not done that book, I would not have been interested in doing any other book. I call that book my foundation novel, or rather my platform novel. That's what I call it, kind of playing with the idea of the platform sutra of the 6th patriarch of Buddhism. In other words, as a platform, it is the book upon which everything I've written and published since then stands upon. But I had to do that book. To give you an example, Middle Passage would not have been possible had I not done that book. Because I worked out strategies for how do you tell a story set in the past for contemporary readers. It's not a historical novel. It's a philosophical novel set in a historical moment. It's a slave narrative, Ox Herding Tale is, but Ox Herding Tale is a slave narrative, but it's kind of updated as a form for late 20th century readers and infused with, at the time, as much Western and Eastern philosophy as I could muster, as the main character works his way through an exploration of the question, what is the self?
And you felt that Walker's novel, The Color Purple, didn't push the boundaries enough?
It doesn't push boundaries at all.
What do you think?
Not intellectually or aesthetically. I've met Alice, I know her, and it's a book that did what it needed to do, but it is not one of those performances that advance our literature, either intellectually or aesthetically.
You've also written a wonderful nonfiction book, Being and Race, which explores Black writing since 1970. And I want to enlarge the scope, just a little bit of that, just to get your quick take on some of the iconic figures of American literature. Okay. You mentioned Richard Wright.
Yes.
What made him such a great writer?
Well, he is often called the father of modern black fiction, and he kind of opened up a franchise for the protest novel in the 30s with his book Black Boy, and then this book Native Son, which was the first black bestseller, really. And that's a good thing and a bad thing, because you create imitators, who don't do quite as well as Wright, and then you can lock yourself into never exploring beyond, the kind of styles that made you famous. But yeah, he stands there as a kind of towering figure in the middle of the 20th century.
You also mentioned our Oklahoma author. We're also proud of him, Ralph Ellison.
Oh, right. Ellison goes a step beyond Wright. You see, if Native Son is a great contribution to the literature of naturalism, which I think it is, we should talk about it that way. Ellison's book is surrealistic. It goes beyond naturalism. I just recently took that book apart. Every image, every line, every chapter, every paragraph, because in Seattle, Intiman Theater would like to do an adaptation, stage adaptation of the novel. A few years ago, they did Native Son, and they did a fantastic job. I was a consultant for that, and Wright's daughter, Julia, came from Paris to see the production. She said it was the best that she'd ever seen of her father's work. So, they do at the Intiman classic works of fiction. So we'll see where it goes. You know, I've got the scene outline, you know, for the novel, so I'm very familiar with it right now.
Well, James Baldwin.
Baldwin is one of our most, I would say Baldwin is one of our most important essayists. He contributed 10 essays that will stand beside anything in American literature in that genre. He himself, I think, felt he didn't quite do as well as a novelist. Now, we can talk about the first book, Go Tell It on the Mountain, because it breaks new ground. It is the first book to dramatize what goes on inside the black church. And that was, you know, that was like 1953. That was the year Ellison won the National Book Award, the year after he published Invisible Man. So those books came very close together. But I think, yeah, as an essayist, he is first rank, first caliber.
Zora Neale Hurston.
Zora Neale Hurston is important, and I'll tell you why. When Wright dominates, Richard Wright dominates with a naturalistic mode, you know, and the protest novel, she's doing something else. She's doing something more cultural. You know, Their Eyes Were Watching God. It's not a protest novel. It's about relationships between the main character and various men and in black culture. She has a background as an anthropologist, you know, with the preservation of black culture. So that works its way into the text as well. So it's a very different kind of book and was overlooked, generally speaking, until Alice Walker made a campaign, you know, to bring it to people's attention. But it was around in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. It never kind of went out of print. University presses would keep it alive. But people were looking only for a certain kind of work of fiction by a black writer. And of course, Wright established that. Now the relationship between, think about Wright and Baldwin. Baldwin went to Paris and met Wright, and he said, "You're the father, I have to kill you." All right? So there's this jockeying going on about, because this is the way the world used to be. Who's going to be the black writer to speak for all of these millions of black people? And, you know, there's this jockeying for that position. I think that's a tragedy.
Yes.
That, I mean, you don't have people jockeying to be the spokesman for white America, okay? So why do you have to have one for black America? Why cannot you have multiple voices? Why can't you have your Updikes and have your Saul Bellows, and they all have a vision, you know what I'm saying? Rather than just one individual. But that's the way, in America, we have tended to think about black American writing. It's that old question, who speaks for the Negro, right? Well, it's bogus. Now, I'll tell you why it's bogus. If you segregate people, you have whites living over here, and you got a dividing line. You have blacks living over here, and they don't talk to each other. Well, the white community is going to wonder, well, what do black people need? What are they thinking? So back in the area of segregation, which was about 70 years, 1890s to the 50s or 60s, a person would be selected, usually a minister, somebody who knew the community, and he'd come over and he'd say, "Look, we need money for schools, we need blah, blah, blah." So, and sometimes it would be a writer. It would be a writer, speaking about, the oppression during that period. Well, that was created by this era of segregation, the idea of the black spokesman. You don't need that after 1965. You can go and have every individual black person speak for his or her own needs. And understand, I hope, that one person doesn't speak for millions. That's a rather absurd idea. It kind of is our experience so simple that one person can articulate it? I rather doubt that.
Oh, very well said. In your own writing, you've been applauded for your interesting interplay between comedy and serious ideas, and several critics have commented on that. Does that interplay come naturally to you, or did you have to cultivate that?
Well, I think I worked very hard at getting humor into things like Oxford Tale. The humor, this is set during the era of slavery. Slavery is not funny. However, there can be individuals who are humorous or antic. If, for example, black American humor during the era of slavery was a survival mechanism. You used humor to survive a bad situation. It's like people who were Jewish during the Holocaust, using humor to survive that terrible event and not lose your humanity. Humor allows you to take a step back and also not lose your humanity. So I worked at that in Oxford Tale, Middle Passage. I didn't quite push it in Dreamer. Because of the tragedy involved with the loss of Martin Luther King, the assassination. There was so much that I wanted to just actually be dour about, straight-faced. But I suppose because I was a professional cartoonist and political cartoonist, humor is just something that I worked on, different kinds of humor. And there are. I mean, you've got wit, you've got irony, you know, you've got gags, you've got pratfalls, you know, there's lots of different kinds of things that we call humor. And I think that some are appropriate, you know, for any work that we're doing.
Your novel, Dreamer, is a fascinating story. Were you intimidated at all by the subject matter? I mean, you're writing about an icon.
True. I spent 2 years researching Dr. King's life before I wrote a single sentence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I read all of the biographies of King. I went to his birth house. I went to the Lorraine Motel, where the room where he stayed before he was assassinated. I read a lot of material. I listened to tapes. I read studies of his speeches, comparing him to other theologians. About 2 years before I even felt ready to be able to inhabit, you know, his orientation, because it's not my vision in the book. It's his. And he has a vision, but we often don't express, when we talk about King, we don't talk about him as this nation's ethical philosopher. He was the nation's preacher for 14 years, you know, and so there's an entire vision there. It's not just a man who is a civil rights activist. This is a man who had an entire vision of life based on what he called the beloved community. We weren't just trying to desegregate lunch counters, he said. What we want, the ultimate goal, is the beloved community. And I isolate 3 main features of King's philosophy. One is obviously integration, because he believed sincerely that our lives are already integrated in terms of our interdependence on each other. Another major feature is nonviolence, not just as a strategy during demonstrations, but nonviolence as a way of life. And the third thing I isolate as a feature of King's philosophy is agape. Agape meaning the way God loves man, unconditionally. You don't love Bull Connor at the moment, you know, in the 50s, because he's just he's horrible. But you say to yourself, he can change. He can change. So what you do with agape is it's like if you're a parent and your teenager is 13 or 14 and acting up, and you say, you know, I love her, but I don't like her today, okay?
Yeah.
But she will grow out of that with your help, or he will grow out of that. So it's the kind of love that a parent has, you know, for a child. It's very much about who they can potentially become.
Did you get a different perspective on King as you wrote the book? Did your opinion of him change at all as you got to know him more intimately?
Yes, I suppose so. It's hard to say exactly in what ways at the moment. I was like most Americans when I started, and this is why I did the book. I only knew King through his reflections and refractions. I only knew that little segment we play from the I Have a Dream speech in January, right, on the radio. You have to look at his sermons, you have to look at his lectures. He didn't live long. That's the tragedy. He died at age 39. So there isn't a lot of history for you to study from, you know, his childhood until Memphis. And he lived a very accelerated life during that period of time, particularly after Montgomery. But even before that, he got his PhD when he was about 25 years old. And then from that point on, Montgomery, the entire world has expectations of him. So he moves from being a civil rights advocate to being, in the second phase, I believe, a peace advocate after he receives the Nobel Peace Prize. And that prepares him for the final phase of his life, which was just beginning, which was addressing economic issues in the last 2 or 3 years of his life. That's why he went to Memphis on behalf of the garbage men, you know, who were striking.
Was there a pivotal moment in your research when you felt that you did get to know him beyond that iconic status in that video clip?
You know, he didn't have very much of a private life. The world did not permit Dr. King to do that. I looked, you know, I wanted to see if he talked about art. I wanted to know what novels he read and liked. Yeah, there isn't a lot of time for that. He always bemoaned the fact that he had a stack of books that he always wanted to get to and never could.
You're known for keeping writers' workbooks. Practically speaking, how do they fit into your writing regimen?
Oh, I keep a lot. Oh, they sit on my shelf like that. I have so many of those.
Yeah.
For me, they're a memory aid. If I'm revising a new story, I go through all my workbooks going back to 1972 because there might be one image, one phrase, one word appropriate for this new story. And after 30, 40 years, there's no way to remember all of that, you know?
No.
And so it takes me, if I'm really rushing through it, 8 hours. But it might take me 3 or 4 days of going through my notebooks to see if there's one thing that I took a note on, a work of art, you know, because I take notes on everything that I read, or newspaper clippings, you know, a story that I'm interested in, or I'm sitting at my desk, you know, and all of a sudden I get a piece of language that seems exactly right to me. So I'll write it in there. So it is where all of my thought and feeling go. And so for my revising process, I rely on my notebooks all the time. It's towards the end. It's the last thing I do. And to be honest about it, I throw away about 20 times what I keep. Faith in the Good Thing, I threw out 1,100 pages. My manuscripts tend to be about 250 pages long. Ox Riding Tail was 2,500, 3,000 for Middle Passage, and over 3,000 for Dreamer. I revise a lot, and I go over every sentence and every word, because basically here's what I want. I want a book so tight, so organic, it's like the human body. Mm-hmm. If you pull out a sentence, it's like pulling off a finger off a body. It will affect the sentence in front of it and the sentence behind it. It'll create a whole rhythmically. So when you write for both meaning and music. And when those two are fused, you cannot pull out a syllable. Every paragraph has to have something special in it. For me, it might be an idea, it might be a descriptive moment, and an image or whatever. It's like poetry. It has to be that tight, or like a philosophical equation. Nothing can be pulled out. And so my process of revision is one of doing lots and lots of writing and only saving the stuff that justifies itself paragraph to paragraph on the page for me. Because I see no reason to do that. I would rather write one novel that is as rich as 5 or 6 than write 5 or 6 novels. I would rather write one novel that has like 5 or 6 books in terms of ideas and images and so forth compressed into it. So it is an experience that is richer. I mean, you see, before I published Faith in the Good Thing, I wrote 6 novels in 2 years. I wrote one every 10 weeks. That was before I met John Gardner.
Yeah.
And I was on a quarter system. 10 weeks, yeah. I said, you start a class, you finish, why can't I do a novel? And as a journalist, I was used to writing, so I did 10 pages a day, 5 days a week. You can get a 300-page novel, believe me, in 10 weeks doing 3 drafts. But Gardner slowed me down. So I spent, on Faith in the Good Thing, 9 months, which I thought was the longest period of time I'd ever spent on anything in my life. But then I realized what was at stake. So Ox Riding Tail was 5 years. Middle Passage was 6 years, and Dreamer was 7 years. I mean, this is something, I'm not doing this for commercial reasons. I'm not doing it for the money. I'm doing this as a meditation in which I'm trying to figure out something using everything at my disposal. And if it takes 5 or 6 years, great. And then hopefully, maybe there'll be something useful to a reader in it. So I really don't write for, just to get another book out. To me, that's not interesting.
How does that dynamic change when you move from a novel to a short story?
Short stories, I love the short story form. When I was 17, that's when I began publishing stories. My first 2 or 3 were in my high school newspaper when I was 17 years old. I love the short form. I have 3 collections of short stories. Yes. It has to be terse. As somebody once said, a novel can you can get away with a lot in a novel. You can have a lot of fat, you can have a lot of surplus, but what the French call remplissage, literary padding. You can't do that in a short story. It has to know its business. Poe defined the modern short story for us quite well. It has to be efficient, and it has to be economical. It has to have a plot, and many novels don't. Are not very well worked out plots. No. And as John Gardner once said, plot is the writer's equivalent to the philosopher's argument. Plot is your saying as a writer, this is how the world works. And so it's very, very important. Plot, of course, is anchored in character. Character is the engine of plot. So I think for a short story, you've got to be clear about where this thing is going through its beginning, middle, and end, or 3 acts. But I also happen to believe a novel should be the same way. It should have that same compactness and terseness and lack of waste.
Charles, we just have a couple of minutes left here, and I want you to tell us about this very special project, Night Lights.
Well, Night Lights is an anthology, just came out, of 21 works by 21 authors who live in the Northwest. And it's basically, these works were written for a fundraiser done by Humanities Washington. I, 12 years ago, suggested to them the idea, why don't you have writers do a new story every year, and you give us the theme, your board gives us a theme, and we'll write a new story. And so they did that, and every year the theme has been related to bedtime. It could be insomnia, it could be a good night kiss, it could be a midnight snack, and writers show up, write a new story, reread it, and fundraising happens. I've done it every year for 12 years. My friend, the late August Wilson, did it 2 or 3 years, and this last year, October 1st, they made the most they've ever made in a single night, $110,000.
That's incredible, isn't it?
It really is. In these times, because Humanities Washington is about supporting the arts and humanities. They have a program called Mother Read, Father Read, in which they produce books that allow adults who cannot read to learn how to read and then to read to their children. Right? Mother Read, Father Read. And so the fundraiser funds those kinds of efforts. So I've always been more than, and we do it for free, I've always been more than willing to contribute, you know. And afterwards, you know, I publish the story somewhere.
It's been so wonderful visiting with you today.
Well,
thank you for joining us.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.